The email arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Congressional Subcommittee on Children and Families requests your testimony regarding the Child Welfare Modernization Act. Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please confirm availability. I stared at my laptop screen in the dim light of my home office, surrounded by case files and policy research that had consumed my evening. 15 years of social work practice, 5 years developing evidence-based intervention programs, countless late nights documenting outcomes and writing policy recommendations. All leading to this moment, an invitation to testify before Congress about child welfare reform. I confirmed my availability and spent the next 36 hours preparing testimony that would translate complex social work practice into language that lawmakers could understand and act upon. The policy research I'd been conducting quietly for years suddenly felt urgent and vital. But first I had dinner plans with my parents. Wednesday evening at their house, the same weekly tradition we'd maintained since I moved back to the DC area after graduate school. Dad's famous barbecue chicken, Mom's potato salad, and inevitably, Dad's gentle but persistent questions about when I'd consider a more practical career. Jennifer's here. Mom called as I walked through their front door carrying a bottle of wine in my laptop bag. The familiar scent of Dad's barbecue sauce filled the house, mixing with the sound of evening news from the living room television. "How was work today, sweetheart?" Dad asked, emerging from the kitchen with grilling tongs in hand. At 71, he still handled all outdoor cooking duties with the precision of his former engineering career. "Busy," I replied, setting my wine on the kitchen counter. "Finished a major project that's been consuming most of my time lately." "Another report about troubled families?" he asked, and I could hear the familiar concern in his voice. "I worry about you spending so much time around those situations." Dad had never understood my choice to pursue social work. As a retired aerospace engineer who'd spent 40 years designing systems that either worked perfectly or failed catastrophically, he struggled with the ambiguous nature of human services work. Problems that couldn't be solved with mathematical precision frustrated his analytical mind. "The families aren't troubled," I corrected gently, a conversation we'd had dozens of times. "They're dealing with complex systemic challenges that require coordinated intervention." "If you say so," he replied, returning to the kitchen to check on dinner preparations. "Though I still think your talents could be better applied to problems with clear solutions." Mom appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How many families are you working with now?" she asked. "Direct practice caseload is about 30 families," I explained. "But most of my time lately has been focused on program evaluation and policy development." "Policy development?" Dad repeated, pausing in his dinner preparations. "What kind of policies?" "Evidence-based interventions for child welfare systems," I said, accepting that this conversation would probably follow its usual pattern of Dad trying to understand work that seemed frustratingly unmeasurable to his engineering mindset. "Social work is bleeding heart nonsense," Dad grumbled, carrying plates to the dining room table. "Doesn't solve real problems. Just creates more paperwork and bureaucracy." I followed him to the dining room, helping Mom set the table with her good china. "Actually, evidence-based practice focuses on measurable outcomes and data-driven interventions." "But does it actually work?" he asked, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Can you point to specific families and say, 'I fixed this problem'?" "Social work doesn't fix people," I explained, sitting down across from Mom. "It creates conditions and provides resources that enable families to address their own challenges." Dad served the barbecue chicken with the same methodical precision he'd applied to engineering projects. "That sounds like a lot of words to avoid admitting you can't measure success." "We can measure success," I said calmly. "Reduced child abuse rates, increased family stability, improved educational outcomes, decreased involvement with juvenile justice systems. The data exists." "If you say so," he replied skeptically. "Though it seems like those problems just keep getting worse despite all the social workers." I accepted his perspective without argument, the same way I'd learned to navigate family dynamics over years of professional training in conflict resolution and systems thinking. Dad's skepticism about social work reflected broader societal misunderstandings about the field, and family dinner wasn't the appropriate venue for comprehensive education about evidence-based practice. "Tell us about this project you finished," Mom suggested, clearly trying to redirect conversation toward more neutral territory. Policy research and program evaluation, I replied simply. Analyzing intervention outcomes and developing recommendations for system improvements. More reports that no one will read, Dad muttered, cutting his chicken with surgical precision. I mentioned helping a few families navigate complex situations, but kept the details general. Professional confidentiality prevented sharing specifics, and my family had heard enough case stories over the years to understand the basic challenges of child welfare work without needing additional examples. Jennifer works so hard, Mom said supportively. She's always writing reports and attending meetings about improving services for families. Meetings, Dad repeated with mild disdain. Engineers build things. We design systems that solve specific problems. Social workers have meetings about problems. Different types of problems require different approaches, I said diplomatically. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and Mom's famous apple pie. Dad reached for the television remote, flipping through channels until he found the evening news. The familiar rhythm of family time continued with half-focused attention on current events and gentle conversation about weekend plans. Let's see what's happening in the world, Dad said, settling back in his favorite recliner with his coffee. The local news covered traffic accidents and weather forecasts. National news discussed economic policy and international developments. Then the anchor transitioned to legislative coverage. Tomorrow's congressional hearings will address several significant policy initiatives, including proposed reforms to the nation's child welfare system. I glanced up from my coffee, recognizing the context for my upcoming testimony. The Child Welfare Modernization Act has attracted bipartisan support, the anchor continued, with lawmakers citing evidence-based research demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated intervention programs. Child welfare reform, Mom said thoughtfully. That's the kind of work Jennifer does, isn't it? Similar issues, I confirmed, not mentioning my direct involvement in the policy development process. More bureaucracy, Dad commented predictably. Congress solving problems by creating more paperwork for social workers. The news segment concluded with information about tomorrow's hearing schedule, and Dad changed the channel to find something more engaging than legislative coverage. We spent the remainder of the evening discussing family plans for the upcoming holidays and Dad's latest home improvement projects. I should get going, I said around 9 o'clock, gathering my purse and laptop bag. Early morning tomorrow. More meetings? Dad asked with familiar resignation. Something like that, I replied, hugging them both goodbye. Thursday morning arrived with unusual nervousness. Despite years of public speaking and professional presentations, testifying before Congress felt different. The weight of representing not just my own research, but the entire social work profession's approach to child welfare, created pressure I hadn't anticipated. I reviewed my testimony one final time while drinking coffee in my kitchen, surrounded by research data that would hopefully translate into meaningful policy changes. 5 pages of carefully crafted language that synthesized 15 years of direct practice experience with rigorous program evaluation and outcome measurement. The hearing room filled gradually with lawmakers, advocates, researchers, and media representatives. I sat at the witness table alongside 3 other experts: a child psychologist, a family court judge, and a former foster youth who'd become a legal advocate. The diversity of perspectives represented the complex, interdisciplinary nature of child welfare reform. The subcommittee will come to order, Chairman Williams announced, and I felt the familiar focus that accompanied professional presentations. This was work I understood, policy development based on evidence and experience. Each witness provided opening statements before the questioning period began. I listened to my colleagues describe their perspectives on current system challenges and proposed solutions, recognizing themes that aligned with my own research findings. Dr. Martinez, Chairman Williams said, addressing me directly, your research on evidence-based intervention programs has been cited extensively in the policy development process. Can you explain how data-driven approaches improve outcomes for children and families? I leaned forward to the microphone, drawing on 15 years of experience translating complex social work concepts into language that non-practitioners could understand. Thank you, Chairman Williams. Evidence-based practice in social work means using interventions that have been rigorously tested and proven effective through controlled studies. Instead of relying on intuition or tradition, we implement programs with documented success rates and measurable outcomes. Can you provide specific examples of these measurable outcomes? Representative Chen asked. Certainly. The intervention programs we've evaluated show 37% reduction in repeat child abuse reports, 52% improvement in family stability measures, and 41% increase in children remaining safely with their families rather than entering foster care. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining research methodology, outcome measurement, and cost-effectiveness analysis. The questions from lawmakers demonstrated genuine interest in understanding how evidence-based social work practice could inform policy decisions and improve system efficiency. Dr. Martinez, Representative Johnson said near the end of my testimony, your research suggests that strategic investment in prevention services actually reduces long-term costs to child welfare systems. Can you elaborate on those findings? Every dollar invested in evidence-based prevention programs saves approximately $4 in crisis intervention costs, I explained. Families who receive appropriate early intervention services require less intensive and expensive services later. The hearing continued for 2 hours with detailed discussions about implementation strategies, funding mechanisms, and timeline for system reforms. I found myself energized by the opportunity to translate years of research into potential policy changes that could benefit thousands of families. Following the hearing, I spent another hour responding to media questions and speaking with congressional staff about implementation details. The complexity of translating research into legislation required careful attention to language and practical considerations. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our regular Wednesday dinner, which had been rescheduled due to my congressional testimony. I felt exhausted but satisfied, the way I always did after significant professional presentations. How was your day, sweetheart? Mom asked as I walked through their front door. Productive, I replied, setting down my laptop bag. Long but productive. More meetings about social work? Dad asked from his position at the stove, stirring his famous pasta sauce. Something like that, I said, washing my hands at the kitchen sink. We settled into our familiar dinner routine with conversation about family news and weekend plans. Dad asked about my work with typical skepticism, and I provided general responses about policy research and program evaluation. The congressional testimony felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and television. Mom reached for the remote control, flipping through channels until she found the evening news. Let's see what happened in the world today, she said, settling back on the couch with her coffee. The local news covered typical evening stories: traffic, weather, local politics. Then the anchor transitioned to national coverage. On Capitol Hill today, lawmakers heard testimony about proposed reforms to the nation's child welfare system. I glanced up from my coffee, recognizing the hearing room where I'd spent my afternoon. The Child Welfare Modernization Act received strong support from expert witnesses who testified about the effectiveness of evidence-based intervention programs, the anchor continued. The camera cut to footage from the hearing room, showing the witness table where I'd sat alongside my colleagues. There I was, leaning toward the microphone during my testimony, wearing the navy blue suit I'd chosen specifically for the occasion. Among the witnesses was Dr. Jennifer Martinez, whose research on evidence-based social work practice has influenced policy development nationwide. The anchor explained as my name appeared on screen. Mom's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Honey, she said slowly, isn't that Jennifer speaking to Congress? Dad looked up from his newspaper, staring at the television screen where my photograph appeared alongside impressive statistics about intervention outcomes and cost-effectiveness analysis. Dr. Martinez's research demonstrates that strategic investment in prevention services can reduce child welfare costs while improving outcomes for families. The news anchor continued, showing footage of me explaining research findings to congressional representatives. That's our daughter, Mom said as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Jennifer is testifying before Congress. The news segment continued with clips from my testimony, highlighting key research findings and policy recommendations. Seeing myself on television felt strange, like watching a professional presentation by someone I barely recognized. Evidence-based social work practice, Dad repeated slowly, his engineering mind clearly processing new information. That sounds more systematic than I understood. Dr. Martinez's research has been published in major policy journals and cited by lawmakers developing child welfare legislation, the anchor explained, displaying publication statistics that I hadn't mentioned during family conversations. Published research? Dad asked, looking at me with confusion. You never mentioned publishing research. I write reports and evaluations, I said simply. Publication is part of the process for sharing findings with other practitioners and policymakers. The news segment concluded with information about the proposed legislation and timeline for congressional action. My photograph remained on screen as the anchor transitioned to other national news stories. Dad reached for the remote control and muted the television. The living room fell silent except for the distant sound of evening traffic outside their house. Jennifer, he said quietly, I had no idea what you were really doing. I'm doing social work, I replied. The same work I've been describing for years. But testifying before Congress, Mom said, still staring at the television screen. Your research influencing national policy. That's not what I pictured when you talked about helping families. Social work practice informs policy development, I explained. Direct service experience provides data that can improve systems for all families. Dad set down his newspaper and looked at me directly. All this time I've been dismissing your work as bleeding heart nonsense, and you've been conducting research that influences national legislation. Evidence-based practice requires rigorous data collection and outcome measurement, I said. The same systematic approach you used in engineering applied to human services. But why didn't you explain it that way? He asked. All these years of family dinners and you never mentioned testifying before Congress or publishing policy research. You never seemed interested in the technical aspects, I replied honestly. When I talked about research methodology or outcome measurement, your eyes would glaze over. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing information that clearly challenged his understanding of social work as unmeasurable and ineffective. So when you talk about helping families, Mom said slowly, you're actually developing programs that help thousands of families. Direct practice with individual families provides insights that can improve services for many families, I confirmed. Casework and policy work are connected. And this research gets published in academic journals? Dad asked, his engineering background appreciating the peer review process. Policy journals, practice journals, research publications, I said. Evidence-based practice requires sharing findings so other practitioners can implement effective interventions. Dad stood up and walked to the bookshelf where Mom displayed family photographs. He picked up a picture from my graduate school graduation, where I stood proudly in my cap and gown with my Master of Social Work degree. I remember being worried about your career choice, he said, studying the photograph. Social work seems so unmeasurable. I thought you were avoiding concrete problem solving. Social work is concrete problem solving, I said gently. It just requires different tools than engineering. Tools like research methodology and outcome measurement, he said, beginning to understand the systematic nature of evidence-based practice. And data analysis, program evaluation, policy development, I added. The same logical thinking you taught me applied to family systems instead of mechanical systems. Mom reached for her phone, clearly searching for more information about my congressional testimony. There are articles about your research online, she said. Multiple publications about child welfare policy. Research dissemination is part of the job, I explained. Findings only create change when they're shared with practitioners and policymakers. All these years, Dad said, returning to his chair, I've been telling people my daughter works with troubled families, when I should have been saying she develops policies that improve child welfare systems. Both descriptions are accurate, I pointed out. Direct practice and policy work are equally important. Dad quietly asked to hear more about my work, and for the first time in 15 years, I found myself explaining research methodology and evidence-based practice to a family member who was genuinely curious about the systematic approach rather than dismissive of the unmeasurable nature. We talked for 2 hours about data collection, outcome measurement, policy development, and the peer review process for academic publication. Dad asked technical questions about research design and statistical analysis that reminded me why I'd been drawn to his logical, problem-solving approach throughout my childhood. This is nothing like what I imagined when you said social work, he admitted. I thought you were just listening to people's problems and offering emotional support. Emotional support is one intervention tool, I said. But evidence-based practice includes cognitive behavioral therapy, family systems interventions, crisis management protocols, advocacy strategies and policy development. Policy development, he repeated thoughtfully. You're actually helping write the laws that govern child welfare systems. Research informs policy recommendations, I clarified. Lawmakers make the final decisions, but evidence-based research provides the foundation for effective legislation. 2 weeks later, when the Child Welfare Modernization Act passed committee review with strong bipartisan support, my family read every news article about the legislation. They understood enough about the policy development process to recognize my research contributions and appreciate the significance of evidence-based reform. Dr. Jennifer Martinez's research on intervention outcomes provided crucial data for lawmakers developing child welfare reform. Dad read aloud from the Policy Journal article at our next family dinner. Her evidence-based approach to social work practice influenced key provisions of the legislation. That's our Jennifer, Mom said proudly, and for the first time, I felt that my family truly understood what those words meant. The congressional testimony was professionally satisfying, but having my family finally understand and appreciate the systematic research-based nature of modern social work meant more than any policy recognition. They'd learned to see my career not as bleeding heart nonsense, but as rigorous, evidence-based practice that contributed to measurable improvements in child welfare systems. Next time someone asks what you do, Dad said, I'm going to need at least 10 minutes to explain it properly. Just tell them I help families, I suggested with a smile. Everything else is technical details. Technical details that influence national policy, he added firmly. And that's exactly how I plan to describe my daughter's career from now on. 6 months later, when the Child Welfare Modernization Act was signed into law, Dad called to congratulate me on my contribution to legislation that would benefit families nationwide. He'd spent months learning about evidence-based practice and could discuss social work research with the same analytical precision he'd once applied to engineering problems. I understand now why you chose social work, he said during that phone call. It's systematic problem-solving applied to the most important problems, helping families thrive. That's exactly what it is, I replied, grateful that my family had finally learned to appreciate the complexity and rigor of evidence-based social work practice.